You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, here from New York City, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Sebastian Strangio, the Diplomats Southeast Asia editor. Sebastian, how's it going today?
Good. Thanks for having me, Ankit.
Pleasure to have you back. As I told listeners on the most recent episode, this does continue our series on taking stock of the U.S. election outcome. And yes, President Trump is still not conceded, but here at the Diplomat, we will proceed with the assumption that President-elect Biden will indeed take office on January 20th. But Sebastian, you are the Southeast Asia editor at the Diplomat, and today we're just going to talk all about Southeast Asia. I should preface this by saying Southeast Asia is not a unitary thing. It is a general region. There are, 10 countries plus, I guess, Timor-Leste to talk about. We'll talk about ASEAN. We'll talk a bit about security, economics, but just to begin to sort of set the tone for today's conversation. When you look around the region, which governments do you think are going to be particularly pleased to see Joe Biden and company enter office, and which ones might be less so?
Well, it is hard to say because within each country there is a great deal, I think, of great diversity of opinion, as well as between countries. But I think in general terms we can say that the nations that have most concerns about China will be potentially have the most trepidation about what a Biden administration might mean. I think the Vietnamese government. Potentially the government of the Philippines, although it's complex there given who's in power there, but the security and political establishment in the Philippines. I think have quite appreciated the strong line on China that the Trump administration has taken. And I think there is bound to be some concern that a Biden administration would revert to the status quo ante, the sort of policy of engagement that the Obama administration pursued toward China, which in many quarters, was seen as very conciliatory, that sort of prioritized Chinese perceptions and interests to the detriment of some Southeast Asian partners. And so, I think that there's, in general, there will be, nations that have expressed the most concern about China's actions, particularly in the South China Sea, will wonder whether this robust American pushback against China will continue under Biden. I think in general, the region will appreciate the return to a more level-headed, consistent, and coherent approach, which I think we're likely to see under the Biden administration. I think that following on from the Obama administration, which had a very strong focus on Southeast Asia, at least at a superficial level, we're likely to see senior officials showing up for important ASEAN meetings, putting in a decent amount of face time in the region, and at least rhetorically centering Southeast Asia, at the heart of the Indo-Pacific strategy. But beyond that, I think perceptions of the U.S. election result fracture, once we get down to the national level. And, I think every country has its own mix of concerns and potential, positives or positive reactions to the changeover to a Biden administration.
Mm-hmm. So let's now move a little bit along a few themes here. I think you actually touched on a few of these. Let's begin by talking about the general U.S. Strategic approach to Asia. There's been a lot of talk in recent years under the Trump administration about great power competition, and the conventional wisdom here in the United States now is that Democrats have come a long way since 2016, and there's almost no chance that Biden's just going to pick up the torch on Obama-era Asia policy because of not only things that China has done, but just also Asian allies have new priorities. The administration that's incoming has new priorities on reshoring alliances, trying to repair the damage that has been done. But what's been interesting is ASEAN and Southeast Asia in general, I think, has never been quite comfortable with this, great power competition idea. I think it was Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong of Singapore who memorably at the Shangri-La Dialogue last year, used the metaphor of when elephants fight, the grass underneath gets trodden, and I think a lot of Southeast Asia shares that perception. When it comes to things like re-emphasizing ASEAN centrality and putting Southeast Asia at the center of U.S.-Asia engagement, do you think that aspect of the Obama-style engagement is going to come back, or do you think we'll see more of a focus on the great power competition aspect of things, even if that's slightly reconfigured to suit the tastes of a democratic administration.
Well, I do think there'll be a certain amount of continuity in that focus on Southeast Asia. I think that one problem that the Trump administration has had in the region is that it's pledged undying support to the region in all of its various strategic vision documents, the Free and Open Indo-Pacific Strategy and the National Security Strategy. But when push comes to shove, senior officials haven't shown up for meetings. The U.S. has, its engagement with the region has appeared episodic and sporadic. And I think that, to the extent that we can see a certain amount of continuity between Obama and Biden, and I think the personnel that are likely to populate his administration suggests that that's a fairly safe bet. Yeah, I think we will see, at least rhetorically, more of a reinforcement of that, of ASEAN's importance and centrality. But I also agree that I think a corner has been turned in American perceptions of China, which is unlikely to be reversed. I think that it's one of the closest things to a bipartisan consensus in Washington that China poses a strategic competitor that the U.S. has to take a much stronger line against. I think we're likely to see more coherence and more consistency in how the administration approaches that. But I do think that is likely to persist under Biden. And there's possibilities that there might be tweaks in language and emphasis, but I think the overarching perception that China is a competitor more than a partner will remain, and will probably continue to dictate to a large extent at the American policy towards Southeast Asia. But again, I think there's going to be much more reliance on career diplomats. There's going to be, I think that the administration will probably take on board, the advice and input of a lot of the country and region experts that the State Department has. And so we're likely to see policy that's probably slightly better crafted to the around the perceptions and interests of Southeast Asian states. I think one problem with the Trump administration is that it's never real. It's been sort of offering the region a vision of ideological competition with China, a sort of a showdown between democratic states and authoritarian ones, which obviously in Southeast Asia, a region with, glancingly few democratic states, has not necessarily been received that well. So I think that we'll definitely see more coherence, but I think that the sort of turn against China is likely to be permanent and bipartisan, and is likely to continue under a Biden administration.
So let's talk a little bit about a few specific countries, and I hope listeners will pardon me for skipping a few just due to time constraints, but that's not to say that we're neglecting any particular states. I wanted to begin by asking you about the U.S. relationship with the Philippines. Rodrigo Duterte is going to stick around until June 2022, the end of June 2022, completing his 6-year term. And certainly we saw that he did not have a very good relationship with President Obama. Under Trump, I think there was maybe a little bit of convergence on style, but on substance, we saw road bumps, including the threat to abrogate the Visiting Forces Agreement, which is really still hanging on by a thread. I do suspect, however, that the relationship with the Philippines will be a priority for the Biden folks, just in terms of, especially the folks who are concerned about security, about keeping things like the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Act of 2014 in good health for future competition with China. How do you anticipate the U.S.-Philippines relationship faring under Biden? Are we in for more of the same under Duterte?
Well, I think there's likely to be tensions there. I mean, the Biden administration has spoken quite forthrightly about returning democratic values to the center of American foreign policy. By the same token, one of the main things that's led President Duterte to turn away from the United States and embrace China to the extent that he has been criticisms about his human rights record and pressure from the U.S. Congress over questions of human rights, particularly his war on drugs. And so, to some extent, there's a contradiction here between values and interests that I think exists to some extent across the whole region. But the Philippines offers a particularly clarifying or stark example. And I think that, the US will have to be very careful in how it balances these two things. Simply pressuring Duterte further is unlikely to repair the alliance. If anything, it will probably push things in the opposite direction. Now, there is a presidential election happening in 2 years' time, which, obviously Duterte can only serve a single term. And the question is, just about anybody that replaces him is likely to revert to this sort of the historical mean of pro-American a pro-American foreign policy orientation.
Yeah.
But there's also the possibility that his daughter or another one of his allies might run. And it's important to remember that Duterte remains hugely popular in the Philippines. In fact, the one area of policy that is not popular amongst the Philippine public is his position toward China and the souring of relations with the United States. But public opinion polls suggest that hasn't really affected his overall popularity. And so there's a decent likelihood, and I think that Washington should prepare itself for the likelihood that one of Duterte's close allies or could be elected to the presidency in 2 years' time, giving them giving us another 6 years of strategic ambiguity and sort of friendliness toward China, and hence strain in the U.S. alliance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I've been talking about Duterte for now, 4 years on this podcast, and that the issue of his, the Philippines is interesting because it's the most pro-American country in the whole world by many, many measures, including public opinion. But then again, you do have a Duterte who is famously anti-American, but remains very popular within the country. And I think you set the stage nicely there for what lies ahead. I'm gonna ask you a tough question, which is to comment a little bit on two countries in one go, if that's possible. Take your time. One being Vietnam, which has, I think, under the Obama administration, I think we saw a period of new strategic convergence launched that has largely continued under the Trump administration, although there have been road bumps on trade policy and tariffs and so forth. And the other, Indonesia, the largest Southeast Asian country, and I think an important pivot, so to speak, in Southeast Asia and in the Indo-Pacific more broadly, and a country that's been content to really continue to portray itself as a little bit of a fence sitter, even as its own tensions in the Natuna Sea continue to rise with China. So tell us a little bit about what you think is in store for U.S. Vietnam and U.S. Indonesia ties.
I think on Vietnam, I think that the basic structural underpinning of this strategic convergence will remain. And that's obviously the proximity of China, the ingrained suspicion of China that the Vietnamese Communist Party, and to an even greater extent the Vietnamese people have, and I think that will continue. I think that it's under Obama, it seemed like the values question in relations with Vietnam, the legitimacy of the Communist Party and the primacy of human rights was sort of resolved to some extent. That issue was put to one side in the interests of this broader strategic convergence, and so I'm predicting that we'll see a continuation of the current, even if the convergence doesn't deepen, because there are, of course, limits to how far Vietnam is willing to go in embracing the United States as a strategic partner. It will continue, on the current trajectory. As for Indonesia, I think that, Indonesia has a long tradition of, strategic, or at least long tradition of desiring strategic autonomy, and is allergic to great power entanglements. We saw this recently with the Trump administration's reported request for Indonesia to host P-8 Poseidon surveillance aircraft, which was rebuffed by the Indonesian president. I think that Indonesia will continue to approach relations with China in a very pragmatic way. I mean, it's sought trade and investment from China. The current Indonesian president, Jokowi, largely views China, through the lens of his domestic agenda, which is, premised around bringing economic development, especially to outlying regions of the country, via the construction of large-scale infrastructure. And so, of course, China's Belt and Road Initiative is perfectly situated to to help support that agenda. And so I think that Indonesia will continue to sit on the fence. I think that I think leaders in Jakarta, I think, will probably appreciate a more consistent and coherent approach. I think that the Trump administration's strange mix of ideological rhetoric and episodic, sporadic engagement will they'll be glad to see the end of that, and to have a more consistent approach from what I predict will be a more consistent approach from the Biden administration. But I don't think that Indonesia's basic strategic calculus will shift. I think that it will continue seeking pragmatic benefits from its engagement with China, recognizing the importance of China to its own economic development,
Hmm.
while pushing back where it can, in regions of overlapping maritime claims with China. I think that like all of the claimants in the South China Sea, Indonesia has been very good at quarantining the maritime and territorial disputes from more productive areas of the relationship, and I predict that to continue.
Terrific. So let's move on a little bit and talk about Asian economic governance. And I think this is a timely topic given that just 4 days ago we saw the finalization of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which, contrary to what many mainstream outlets have said, is not a China-led agreement, but an ASEAN-led agreement. And
Right.
what's clear is that there is demand not only in Southeast Asia but elsewhere around Asia, including in East Asia, for greater trade integration. And a lot has happened over the Trump years, particularly given the American aversion under Trump to multilateral trade. Not only have we seen RCEP, but also the CPTPP. My perception here in the United States is that I find it very difficult to imagine an American president signing a multilateral trade agreement in the coming years, be that Biden, be that his successor, Republican or Democrat. Is Southeast Asia moving on from expecting the United States to play an active role in economic rule setting in Asia, or is there still an opportunity for Washington to maybe play a role here under Biden, if not directly by joining RCEP or TPP in other ways?
I don't think it's ever too late, but I think that the backing out of the TPP was a huge missed opportunity for the U.S. to be involved in standard setting, and the writing of the rules of the next sort of era of trade. And here we see sort of a divergence in perceptions between the current political tendencies in the United States and those in Asia, which continue to be very pro free trade and sort of in favor of increased integration and economic engagement. In the U.S., I think that the domestic impacts of free trade agreements, coupled with the general and broad transfer of wealth upwards, the shredding of social safety nets, all of these things have made it incredibly poisonous politically to engage in these sorts of deals. And whereas in Southeast Asia, there's still the region is still in an era in which governments are hungry for more ways of pumping up their economies and generating growth. Now, of course, given the current situation with COVID-19, their desire for economic linkages and restoring those supply chains and those connections is all the greater. And I think the Chinese at the moment are the message coming out of Beijing is very much one of we are a partner, we're an unavoidable partner, we're an inexorable partner. And that China having gotten hold of or controlled the contagion within its own borders to a large extent is in a position now to lead the economic revival, and to help pull itself and the surrounding region out of the COVID slump. I think for the United States, it's obviously very challenging. Its companies are still deeply invested in Southeast Asia. It engages in a huge amount of trade with Southeast Asia. But in terms of writing the next generation of rules around technology standards, e-commerce, sort of the next generation spheres of economic engagement, it really runs the risk of being left behind.
Hmm.
I mean, I think that the Biden administration should seriously consider rejoining the CPTPP. The question is whether, as you say, it would be politically feasible for it to do so at this juncture.
Right. So to close out, I wanted to ask you one last question, and you touched on this a little bit in your answer on the Philippines, which is the issue of values and human rights. And we look around this region. We of course have long-running concerns about human rights violations in Myanmar, political protests in Thailand, continuing authoritarianism in Hun Sen's Cambodia, just to give a few examples. Um, you already said that you think the Biden administration will make an attempt to at least nominally bring principles based rhetoric back to American diplomacy in this part of the world. Um, talk a little bit about the countries we haven't really spoken about. Some of the ones I just mentioned. Do you see any real scope here for the United States to make a difference, or are we sadly going to be in for more familiar rhetoric from the State Department on these issues, but no real change, so to speak?
Well, there's been a lot of talk recently about the differences between a Biden and a Trump administration, but I actually think that there are certain characteristics which will carry over from one administration to the next, and one of them is that tension between you know values and interests. I think that if we look at the Trump administration, I mean, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's proclamations about the threat posed by China were always couched in extremely ideological terms. So even the Trump administration, which Trump himself was very transactional and couldn't have cared less about these principles. But there's certain, I think that there's a sense, within the United States, within American political culture, that American foreign policy is always acting in the interests of promoting democracy and advancing it. It's sort of like it's almost, this rhetoric will always be present, regardless of what the actual policy is. And we see this. It was also the Obama administration and the George W. Bush administration also used this language, in varying extents. So, I think that there's always sort of a tension there, and the question is how seriously this language is taken. I think that during the Cold War, the U.S. engaged very pragmatically with Southeast Asia. It supported dictators when it needed to. It was involved, had a hand in the massacre of anti-communists in Indonesia in the mid 1960s. So clearly, the U.S. acts like any great power in its interests, and then sort of the values are sort of lacquered over the top of that after the fact. But so I see that there's going to be a continuity there. I think that the Biden administration, just like the Trump administration, will face the challenge of claiming to being advancing these values, and especially after the Trump administration, which seemed to undermine these values to such a great extent within the United States. I think that, but I think, there'll be the same contradiction between sort of the avowed aims and then the broader goal of trying to counter China's rising influence in the region. So in places like Myanmar and Cambodia, we're going to see, a robust attempt to promote democratic values is going to exist in tension with the need to prevent further Chinese inroads in these countries.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't really know what the solution to that is. I mean, in the case of Myanmar, arguably you have the one case in Southeast Asia where the U.S. government and its allies absolutely should be standing up for values. I mean, we haven't, what many people suspect to be a genocide taking place. 750,000 people have been forced out of the country and languish in massive refugee camps. I mean, there's a strong argument that if there's any situation in which we should use that sort of language, it's this. I think that, to some extent, promoting values is almost a bet on the future. It's a bet that, people everywhere want freedom, and that when that freedom comes, if the U.S. is in support of those principles, then it will reap a strategic benefit. But I think we have to I think have a little bit more of a complex view of what authoritarianism is in these countries, and that actually it emerges from the context of these specific countries. It's not something that's imposed on the outside by the Chinese government or indeed by the U.S. government. And that democracy is also not something that's imposed from the outside.
Hmm.
And that the U.S. should probably adopt a more selective and pragmatic approach towards Southeast Asia, because the reality at the moment is that there are few nations in the region that can be described as both democratic and liberal. And this is a political reality which is going to pose a challenge for any outside country that seeks to put values at the forefront of its engagement.
Hmm. No, I think that's exactly right. And if we're talking about betting on the future, one of the bets I feel pretty good about making right now is I don't think the U.S. is going to be in a position to be in the democracy building game for a while, given our own difficulties at the moment. So we'll
precisely.
we'll look forward to seeing what the Biden team will come up with. But Sebastian, I really want to thank you for taking the time to offer your insights on what lies ahead, and looking forward to being back once we have a better sense of where the U.S. might hit a few roads in the bumps in the road when it comes to Southeast Asia. But also, I think looking, I'd love to have you back to talk a bit more about the agency of these various Southeast Asian states amid intensifying great power competition, because I think that often does get overlooked in conversations in Washington. So thanks a lot for joining me.
Thanks, Ankit. I look forward to the next one.
For listeners, if you've been a subscriber to the podcast but you haven't yet left us a review, we'd really appreciate if you could do that. It really helps get the word out about the show. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do so. We'd love for you to keep up with future coverage on this podcast. Finally, before we close, a quick note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics Podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.